Creating a camera track in Cinema 4D requires the motion tracker. So we need to go up to the motion tracker menu, click, and then load the motion tracker. Once the motion tracker is in your objects panel, make sure it's selected and make sure you have the attributes panel active. We need to go to the footage channel, and in there we can specify the clip we'd like to import. So I'll just click the button right next to it and go to my exercise files. In the assets folder, there's a tracking footage folder. In there, you'll see a clip called Tracks to Track. Now, once the clip is imported, notice it's being resampled at 33% of its scale. Sometimes when you have really shaky footage or grainy footage, resampling like this gives you a much more smooth track. Notice we can specify a frame start and a frame stop, but before we hop out of this channel, I want to go down to the bottom and there's a button that says Create Background Object. When we do that, Cinema 4D is automatically going to load the video into a material and place it on a background element so it'll fit seamlessly into your Cinema 4D project. Now, in order to analyze the data, we need to go to the 2D tracking channel. In here, we have two options, automatic tracking or manual tracking. Each time you perform an analysis, you're creating what's known as an auto track. Now, a lot of people just come down and click right on this button. If I click this middle button, it's going to track all the way forward and all the way backwards. Now, if I click Create Auto Tracks, it's going to go ahead and create some points that it thinks it's going to use for the tracks. But in order to actually create an analysis, we need to click one of these four buttons, whether we want to analyze forward, backward, or both directions. I'm going to go ahead and just enable a forward track. Now, if you're not sure how the footage is going to function, I definitely encourage you to go ahead and do a forward and backward track. That just gives Cinema 4D two separate passes at the video clip, and it could lead to a more smooth track. Notice in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a processing progress bar that actually moves through the scene. Once your track is finished, you'll see the message down in the lower left-hand corner. Okay, now if we look in our editor window or our viewport, here you can see we have a bunch of different points. To see how these points work for our track, go ahead and just press play. Now, if you haven't watched the clip yet, it's going to take a second to load the footage into your cache. But once it gets in there, it should play back a little more smoothly. Now, I personally think this grid background is a little distracting for right now. So I'm going to go up under Filter and disable my grid. I'll still keep the origin in the scene just so I have some reference for my Cinema 4D project. Notice when we watch the footage, you can see how each of these little points has a tail, and that tail is showing us where the tracks used to be in frames previous and frames upcoming. Notice not all the tracks stay in the image throughout the entire sequence. To see the tracks, let's go to the Reconstruction channel. In here, I have two separate channels, Reconstruction or Display. Let's focus on Reconstruction. For the Solve mode, I usually like to try and do a full 3D reconstruction. In here, you could specify if you just want to perform a specific kind of track or just a nodal pan, meaning your camera is just panning on a point. Now, I'll do a full 3D reconstruction, and down here for focal length, you can say unknown but constant. I usually try that, but since I shot this footage, I already know what it is. So let's click on the pull down, and I'm going to say known and constant, because I did shoot this with a prime lens. I just happen to be holding it freehand. The focal length was 85 millimeter. So rather than changing it here, I'm going to click on the pull down and see if it's listed. And it's not, so I'll just go ahead and choose 80, but then change it to 85. Notice the sensor size says 36, but that's equivalent of a 35 millimeter photography camera. Now all we have to do is run the 3D solver. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. If you want to free up your system a little bit, you can go ahead and stop playback. Notice the progress line in the lower left corner. Now, once the solve is finished, we need to go up to our motion tracker and open up its options. In here, you can see we have a solved camera and we have auto features. Well, let's select our solved camera first and then enable it. And notice when we do that, it looks like all these points have swept in and filled up the 3D space. Now, with the solved camera selected, we have a couple of different details. In the object panel, this is where we have our different camera settings. Notice this camera is hooked up with the physical renderer if I wanted to go ahead and enable that. This is a normal camera that you would have created in Cinema 4D. But let's open up the auto features. In the auto features, this is where we have a whole host of null objects. Now, these null objects specify points that were tracked. Now, Cinema 4D does a great job of actually letting you know whether it thinks it was a successful track or not. Because if we scroll down, notice the color slowly starts to change and fade and then get more and more red. So the high quality tracks are closer to the top. Now, why would you need these tracks? Well, even though we have these track points set up, we don't necessarily know where the origin is in my scene. So now if I wanted to immediately just drop some footage in here, I don't necessarily know the overall layout of my scene. So that's what you use these points for. If you find these points to be a little too small, you can select the motion tracker, and under the display channel for reconstruction, here we have our 3D feature display. I can change that radius up to something like 5. And then when we go back to our solved camera, notice the circles are significantly larger. So we've successfully completed our first motion analysis and our initial camera track. Now, like I said, the next step in the process is trying to figure out where the origin is in the scene and setting up a ground plane.